at the Asia Pacific Center for Security, who's going to lend a really great perspective and be our discussion lead today. Please go ahead and join me in welcoming Brent and our panelists.
Thank you, Malia. Good afternoon, everyone. As Malia indicated, my name is Brent Christensen. I'm currently serving as the Senior Policy Advisor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Aloha. That's in Honolulu, Hawaii. I've spent most of my Foreign Service career working on China or Taiwan issues, and most recently served as the Director of the American Institute in Taiwan. I'm delighted to be here today to lead today's discussion on China's national rejuvenation and strategic ambitions. We have a very impressive lineup on our panel today. Allison Hooker, Vice President of American Global Strategies, Peter Mattis, Director for Research and Analysis at the Special Competition Studies Project, and Abe Denmark, Vice President for Programs and Director of Studies at the Wilson Center. Each of these experts has deep knowledge and understanding of China and of the East Asian region. Perhaps I could take just a few minutes to review President Xi Jinping's national rejuvenation agenda, and then touch on some of the main issues in the U.S. China relationship to provide a baseline for our discussion. I will then ask each of our panelists to give their remarks and leave some time at the end for questions. I should add that my own comments reflect only my views and not those of the U.S. government. I have to make sure that's out there right up the front. Anyway, early in his administration, President Biden declared that we are at an inflection point in history, a great powers contest between democracy and authoritarianism. And in this struggle, China has been identified as the most significant threat to the current US-led liberal international order. On May 26th, Secretary of State Tony Blinken gave a long-awaited speech on the Biden administration's approach to the People's Republic of China, pointing to China as the only country with both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do so. In Xi Jinping, the United States faces an extraordinarily ambitious leader who sees himself as a visionary on par with Mao Zedong. Xi's two predecessors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, were both limited to 2 5-year terms, but Xi has pushed through an amendment to the Constitution to eliminate term limits and is expected to be given a 3rd term this fall at the 20th Party Congress, and conceivably a 4th term after that. Just after coming to power in 2012, Xi announced what would become the hallmark of his administration: the China Dream, a great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. This rejuvenation is a grand strategy to restore China to its past glory as the world's predominant power, all couched in a narrative of grievance over the so-called century of humiliation that China suffered at the hands of foreign powers from the First Opium War in 1839 to the founding of the PRC in 1949. To paraphrase a recent political slogan, one could say that the essence of Xi's rejuvenation strategy is to make China great again. So one very important goal of the rejuvenation agenda is reestablishing control over all of Greater China's territory, including Hong Kong, the South China Sea, and Taiwan. Xi regards Taiwan as really the last piece of the puzzle to restore China's territorial integrity. It's hard to overstate Taiwan's importance to the PRC. And in fact, in the negotiations for the United States to normalize relations with China, Beijing's single most important condition was that the United States recognize Taiwan as part of China. The United States and China were finally able to work out a formulation for the Shanghai Communique that was signed during President Nixon's historic visit to China in 1972, whereby the United States acknowledged the Chinese position that there was but one China and Taiwan as part of China, but did not recognize it. The United States went on to recognize officially the PRC in 1979, and U.S. relations with Taiwan thereafter became unofficial. But unofficial does not mean unimportant. because since then, Taiwan has developed into an impressive democracy and a high-tech economic powerhouse. In recent years, the United States and other countries have come to a much greater appreciation of how important Taiwan is as a security and economic partner and as a successful Chinese-speaking democracy in Asia. And the recent worldwide semiconductor shortage has made everyone acutely aware of how essential Taiwan is for the global economy. U.S. support for Taiwan today in Washington is exceptionally strong and also bipartisan. And as most of you probably noticed, President Biden expressed some very strong support for Taiwan during his recent visit to Tokyo. In Secretary Blinken's May 26 speech on the Biden administration's approach to the PRC, he highlighted some key issues of concern. At the top of the list was his concern that Beijing is seeking to undermine the current rules-based international order and all of the laws, agreements, principles, and institutions that go with it. Other concerns included Beijing's defense of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Tibet, and its quashing of political freedoms in Hong Kong, intellectual property theft and coercive use of technology, the unsustainable lending and predatory trade practices, lack of reciprocity for market access and state subsidies for favored industries, PRC's economic coercion tactics, Beijing's, and finally, the PRC's efforts to threaten, intimidate, and isolate Taiwan. So despite the many global issues of serious concern in the relationship, Secretary Blinken says the United States still seeks cooperation with China on climate change, food security, nuclear proliferation, narcotics trafficking, and health challenges like the COVID pandemic. I'm sure we'll hear more about some of these issues from our panelists today. I would now like to invite Allison Hooker to make remarks, but first let me just add a couple more bio notes for your appreciation. Allison Hooker, as I said, is the Vice President at American Global Strategies, but she has over 20 years of U.S. government experience, 6 of which were at the National Security Council, where she served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Asia. And no one knows more about North Korea than she does. So, Allison, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Brent, and really great to be here with you all today. Thanks for braving a post-lunch session with us, and hopefully we can make this conversation lively and interesting enough to hold your attention. Yeah, as Brent said, I just finished a 20-year career in the federal government, 14 years at the State Department, focused on North Korea, and really worked that problem for all of those years as hard as I could. And then in 2014, I was pulled over to the White House in the Obama administration to be director for Korea at the National Security Council. And as a practitioner, well, to finish that statement, as Brent said, I then moved on to be senior director for Asia. I spent 6.5 years. I just have to add that half year in because it's
a tough half year.
Yes, it was a tough half year, and I feel like I get to say that. But it was a really extraordinary experience. 2.5 years under President Obama, working the North Korea issue, which is related to China, and maybe I always have to work North Korea into whatever I'm talking about. But maybe we can get around to speaking about that a little bit. But in the last three-ish years, really focused more and more on China. And then in the last 2 years, I was senior director over Asia, which in those last 2 years, we were extremely focused on China. And as you know, the COVID pandemic started in that period, which focused our attention even more. But to the point, I come at this China issue as a practitioner, a foreign policy practitioner, and then first through the lens of North Korea. But as I said, as we over time, China became more and more central to our work, to my work. And I'm saying all of that for a reason, not just to talk about my background, but we've seen a real transition, as Brent noted, the focus on China, the thinking about China within the U.S. government and at the highest levels of U.S. government. And I started in 2014. It was a different time. It was a really different time. I had very good colleagues there in the National Security Council Asia Directorate. I worked a lot with Abe Denmark at that time, who was at the Pentagon, but it was a different time. And during that period, Xi Jinping, just before I started in 2014, of course, Xi Jinping had just become General Secretary. He had just started his being president of China in 2012, and it was also in that time frame, just ahead of that, that he rolled out this China Dream, this national rejuvenation. I always want to add one more syllable to that, rejuvenation strategy, rejuvenation policy. And my colleagues focused on China at the time. Like everyone, we were trying to figure out, oh, this is interesting. What does this mean? It has a nice ring to it. America Dream, China Dream. It sounds familiar. Trying to unpack exactly what that was going to mean, not just for the relationship, but for China on the global stage. And so those two last, in my experience, those last 2.5 years on the National Security Council focused on China. We're more, seeing China more from, as you've heard the terminology, more from the perspective of, global stakeholder, trying to be, more of a partner with China, to view China's rise as, seeing them as a benign power rising and how we were going to be able to work together. So that was the atmosphere of the time. Of course, there were people that were more deeply focused on China than I was, that were seeing the writing on the wall, reading more deeply into China, understanding more and more about this rejuvenation plan, about Xi's intentions from that. But it was really after the shift of administrations, again, I'm speaking from my experience only, but it was after that shift of administration that we started to have more focus on what it actually meant. And I did want to, skipping a little part here, but it was during that, also in that time frame, we had the state visit of Xi Jinping to the White House, where in the Rose Garden, and this is pertinent to our later conversation, but the Rose Garden, he makes the famous promise about not militarizing the South China Sea, the features in the South China Sea, which I recall the atmosphere of the time of like, good, now we can move forward. Now we have that, that's a very important thing. Of course, we saw this reversed later, and there is great militarization of those features happening right now. But again, the point in this is to say that as time passed and the administration transitioned, my new colleagues at the NSC, many of whom you've heard from over today, this morning, or if you were here yesterday as well, they're deep experts. To talk about the various components of that, we've heard today, this morning, about the One Belt, One Road policy, and just to run through a few of these things, and then come back in a little bit more detail. We've learned a little bit more about what One Belt, One Road meant, and as we've heard today, that sometimes these various projects came with strings attached, and that countries that were accepting projects would then have to sort of align ideologically with China, and if they didn't, there was an impact on, either on the project or there would be some kind of repercussions. And, other areas that we've heard about today as well, I think that are important really for this group, and mainly the ones I wanted to turn to for our discussion today, was on the economic policy side of things. There's one of the way the policy is being implemented is to focus on, to just say it very frankly and very plainly, to focus on global domination of the economy. The specific policy is called Made in China 2025. There's a lot out there on it already, and I'm sure many of you are well versed in it, but the main purpose is focused on technology, the technology field, and on becoming, basically overtaking the U.S. as the leader in the tech field globally. And as Ambassador Huntsman said today, I think we shouldn't just sort of take that sitting down. America was born out of innovation, and we can meet this challenge, and I think Utah is already doing a great deal of work in that space. But point being, this is the area that I think may be most relevant for the community that we're talking to today. Another focus of the Rejuvenation Plan that's more on the economic side of things is housed or captured in Xi Jinping's domestic policies called the New Development Concept, which is broken down into two wonky things if you don't follow this. One is called dual circulation, another is common prosperity. And the point that's relevant for us is, as Brent said, this is very focused on kind of preemptively decoupling from the United States to be able to have their supply chains be internal, particularly on the tech side, and that will have an impact on the business community as well. So those are, I just want to kind of throw in that direction on elements of the Rejuvenation Plan that I think are most relevant to our conversation. Two last things, just in closing before I turn it over to my colleagues, that are very revealing, kind of about China. One is COVID. The past couple of years have really revealed as well more about China's intentions globally and how it manages itself when, the delivery of PPE is tied to certain actions on the recipient's part, or the PPE may not function correctly. It was a bad time for everyone, so difficult era, but I did, want to point that out, and I think also.
Yes. Anyway, thank you, Allison, for those keen insights. Let me now pass the baton over to Peter Mattis. Peter is Director for Research and Analysis at the Special Competitive Studies Project. This is a new initiative established by former Google CEO Erik to strengthen U.S. capabilities in emerging technologies like artificial intelligence. Peter is especially expert on Chinese military and intelligence issues and on Chinese influence operations. So, over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Brent, for the kind introduction, and thank you also to the World Trade Center Utah and UVU for having us. It's been a great event, and it's been enjoyable all the way through. And I think there are a lot of events in DC where you can say that's just not quite the case. So a very big thank you for everything, working smoothly and being a beautifully done event. So the opening panel today and Allison's remarks focused a lot on what has happened with China under Xi Jinping. And I think it's important to recognize how Xi Jinping has generated departures, but it's equally as important, as Glenn alluded to in his remarks, about the need to recognize the continuity that's there. Because there's a great book by Orville Schell and John Delury called Wealth and Power, and it traces the goal of modernizing China back to the Qing dynasty reformers. And it's a clear story, whether it was the reformers of the Qing dynasty, the revolutionaries in the Kuomintang, or the CCP leadership. Now, they all had various ways of getting there, and there's a difference between the means that you choose. But this is a consistent story. And the first modern leader, if you will, to use national rejuvenation was the so-called reformer Zhao Ziyang in a speech in, I believe, the Party Congress in 1988. So this is something where we should recognize that these are long-standing views. And I think, to me, it's important not just to say, what the views are, but how do we come to them, right? And so, the first part I'll explain a little bit about what I think national rejuvenation is from the documents themselves, and second, how do we know this? How should we understand this, and how can you come up and query us and say, well, is this really true, or is this there? And that you can see it for yourself and make your own, and come to your own judgments. So I find three consistent themes, not just from Xi Jinping, but also from his predecessor Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping, You can even say that Mao certainly had these, as well as many of the people that were around them. And the first key theme is that they want to turn China into a modern socialist country. Now, what does that mean? Now, they actually have a very specific phrase to say we want to create a modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful. Right? And that's a phrase that you sort of look at it and you're like, well, what does that even mean? And this is sort of rule number one of reading some of these documents or the speeches. You know, when everyone comes together for a party congress like they're going to do this fall, these phrases, when they're structured like that, or often have kind of a policy structure or set of documents and speeches below them. What is harmonious China? What is a beautiful China? What is a democratic China? What is a strong one? I think militarily that one's relatively self-evident. Prosperous, meaning economically prosperous. But it's worth noting on those things like democratic, culturally advanced, and harmonious. This is about the party's power and the way in which the party rules. And one of the ways in which the party describes itself as being democratic is as reflecting the will of the people. And the way that it says that it does this is by creating mechanisms to create feedback loops that are really ways for problems to be raised to official levels, but more importantly, ways for the party to control social interactions. And if you want to know what this means in practice and on a national scale, they very helpfully released a white paper last summer on China's democracy. And what this really is a system of loops so that the party can ensure that ideas are circulating, that social activity and enterprise activity is taking place inside realms where they understand it and they control it. And in that respect, they're maintaining their tie to the people. And for them, that's what democratic means. It's not about checks and balances. It's not about a division of powers. It's not about the rule of law. It's not about all of the things that would start to come to mind when we think about what a democracy means in our country. The second goal is national unification. And Brent talked a little bit about this. And we used to think that this meant political control, right? So why would we still talk about control of Hong Kong in 2019 or 2022 is an issue of is having global influence. And it's been said a variety of ways, but the 19th Party Congress speech by Xi Jinping was actually quite helpful in saying, yes, we want global influence. Now, I recognize that the DoD, sorry, Abe, has put out a lot of documents of saying, you know, the PLA is being there for regional military ambitions. And yet, when you look through a lot of the documents and speeches, there's very little to say that there are regional ambitions for the party. They've seen themselves as playing on the global stage. I mean, Mao's biggest disagreement with Stalin was the fact that they disagreed over who should be. Some of you may remember about a decade ago a discussion about a new type of great power relations. Americans caught on to this quite quickly because a new type of great power relations involved us. But that was actually kind of the sub-concept for this new type of international relations. And that was the democratization of international relations in a way like democracy inside the PRC, with the party at the center kind of as a model of hub and spokes that's kind of dictating the terms of interaction and creating the feedback loops that ensure that the party's voice is present whenever anyone's making a consequential decision. The community of common destiny is sort of another layer down. It's kind of like moving from a modern socialist country to a modern socialist country that's prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful. And this is simply a sense of like, what is this global collective that Xi Jinping is talking about? And it is this idea of a community where at least on par with any other value that's there, irrespective of the treaty commitments like the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then the reform of global governance means the refashioning and remaking of international institutions to better incorporate some of China's interests. Now, we can look at that and say, well, the PRC is becoming more powerful on the world stage. Isn't this kind of a reasonable thing that their views should be taken into account? Well, I think there are some places where you can say that there's some good technical reasons for it. But there are other places where when you think about the issue of human rights, where it's enshrined in the UN Charter, it's enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There have been multiple conventions of trying to spell out and explain this, that you have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, you have the competitor organization that was, or treaty organized by the Soviets originally, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. You know, the PRC is trying to redefine these in some very fundamental ways and to affect the operations of these organizations. So let's take the World Bank, for example, where it was a researcher at my commission, the Congressional Executive Commission on China, who was looking through a World Bank statement and discovered that World Bank funds were going to a re-education program in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. They were supporting regional schools, or re-education and vocational schools. They did minimal checking around, but what you had was the World Bank lending its credibility and legitimacy to something that the US government is now calling genocide. Now, if that's not a corruption of the World Bank's purpose, I'm not sure what is. So is this a reasonable accommodation of PRC interests in this? So I think those are the three big themes that kind of jump out and are worth paying attention to. I'd also note that the CCP has identified technology as a domain of competition and as a key source of power. And this is one of the points of Made in China 2025, the 14th five-year plan, the midterm plan for 2035, is to emphasize this point of power in the modern world is going to be decided by if you control it, if you have an advantage in the technology, therefore you accrue the economic advantages, you also accrue the ability to monitor and surveil, to help improve those feedback mechanisms, to ensure compliance with behavior, right? And some of these systems that we've talked about, like that you may have read about, like the social credit system, you know, yes, they are primarily serve a domestic purpose, but if you're a business with operations in China, recognize that you're a part of that domestic purpose too, and that because of the way China or the party defines sovereignty and its sort of security in the space of ideas, if one of us here said, or like I'll just say it right now, Taiwan is not a part of China, the party would views that as a violation of its sovereignty, right? So these kinds of tools that have a domestic use, where you have a connection inside the PRC, can become levers, and technology enables that function, right? Whether you're controlling the sort of the flow of data, whether you're controlling computing centers, mobile data centers, 5G, and if you want sort of a free and open system of communication and commerce, right, the party is more or less saying, no, this is a source of power for us, rather than something that we stay hands off. So why do these documents matter? I'll go really quickly through this. Is that first, they're used to mobilize, right? They're not a document put out as a press statement or anything else. These are documents where the party leadership is speaking to the party faithful, saying, here's how you do your job on a day-to-day basis, right? And you think about this. This is not a small issue. China is a continental-sized country. The party itself is something like, I think, 92 million members with a country of 1.4 billion people. This is a big place, and you have to set clear expectations to give people the understanding of where they're going to go. Now, does this mean that China is monolithic? Does it mean that we shouldn't have some nuance or complexity in the pursuit of these strategic objectives? No, we should recognize China for what it is. And it's got 31 provincial units. I think it's something like 40,000 counties and townships. And all of these places have different resources.
I'm a native Coloradan, so it's a thrill for me to be out west. I feel like Utah is close enough. For me, the only thing is mountains are supposed to be on the west, not on the east. But other than that, it feels like I'm right at home. And it's a real pleasure to share the panel with such an incredible group of experts who I've known for a long time. And as Brent mentioned, I also need to note that these are my views alone and not those of the U.S. government. So I thought I could focus my remarks on a subject that hasn't been discussed much during today's conference so far, which is the Chinese military and how it fits in to the broader objectives, the broader objective of national rejuvenation, and how it looks from Beijing's point of view. Now, it's not a subject that's discussed with nearly the degree of transparency in China as you get with economics or even party matters, but there are a few things that do come out that are fairly authoritative, including speeches by Xi Jinping, some of which, again, are translated, some of which are not. But I wanted to highlight three themes coming out of Xi Jinping's remarks. I'll spend a short amount of time on the first two and a little bit more on the third. The first theme that you hear a lot when Xi Jinping gives remarks to military units, he is, after all, chairman of the Central Military Commission. One of the things he'll often say is that we need to prepare for war. And every so often, this will get translated into English. U.S. media will pick it up. People will get a little nervous for a little bit. Then someone will remind them, actually, he says this a lot. It's okay. That this is not actually saying, let's go. But rather, it's more of a statement on the need for readiness and for practicality in military planning. That these are not theoretical exercises. These are not theoretical ideas. And we need to actually be ready to do this if necessary. The second theme that you hear a lot from Xi Jinping, which doesn't get as much attention because I think it doesn't make a lot of sense to foreign audiences, he talks a lot about the necessity for party control over the military. And this speaks to one of the things that's unique about the PLA. It's very different from the U.S. military, basically any Western military or even many militaries in the East, is that the PLA is not the military of the Chinese nation. Rather, it is the military of the Chinese Communist Party. And this is very important when we get into the roles and missions of the PLA, which I'll get to in a minute. But it's also a critical element for Xi Jinping that he talks about a lot, which is what they call party work, the need for members of the PLA to be regularly indoctrinated with party ideas, with Marxist ideas, and that they be part of this process. And because of that, and I'll get into what this means for roles and missions otherwise, but the key thing that I wanted to emphasize, and that speaks directly to this idea of national rejuvenation, is that Xi Jinping has stated that their goal is to have a world-class military by the middle of the century, I interpret it to mean 2049, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. But what that actually means is, as Peter said before, so what does that mean? What are we supposed to take out of what is a world-class military? There's been a lot of speculation, a lot of analysis on what this may mean. One misinterpretation, I think, that you hear a lot is that they want a military like the best military in the world, the United States. So he's saying we need to have a military like the United States. That is not what I don't believe they're trying to do. I believe they have different ideas of what they're trying to achieve. But I think what's important here, when Xi Jinping said this, not connected to any specific contingency. That this is a matter of status as much as it is about capability. In that major powers, great powers that drive the common destiny of the world, whatever that may be, have world-class militaries. And so that status base that is not connected to any contingency, you can see in some of the significant investments that they've been making in their military over the past several years. China now has, arguably, depending on how you look at it, the largest navy in the world, the largest ballistic missile force in the world. It's exponentially increasing the size of its nuclear capability over the next several years. It's assessed to be, although still less than that of the United States or Russia. Also has advanced air, land, space, cyber capabilities, some of which driving the United States to U.S. officials and the Biden administration to describe China as the pacing challenge. for the United States, what we need to keep pace with, what we need to keep ahead of in order to maintain our advantages. So why? What is the reason for this beyond status? What are they looking at? And I think a helpful frame, actually, something that Brent said that one hears a lot when talking about Taiwan. Taiwan is still the primary focus of the PLA. Specifically, if need be, being able to forcefully unify Taiwan with the rest of the mainland. And part of that being, if necessary, deter or defeat intervention by the United States on Taiwan's behalf. And we can get into what that means. We can get into what we may be learning about those contingencies from Ukraine during the Q&A if you're interested. But I wanted to also talk about something that, Brent mentioned, that Taiwan is the last place that Xi Jinping sees Taiwan as the last place to achieve unification. Then Taiwan will be whole. I'm not so sure about that. Now, officially, China has not identified any other specific areas, but when you look at the Chinese debate universe, the online debates that happen in China, there's a lot of other areas where some folks think that China needs to take control of those areas too. The East China Sea and the Ryukyu Islands that are currently administered by Japan and South Korea. The South China Sea, which are claimed and at times administered by many other countries. The borders with India, which you saw, there was a dispute there where they beat some Indian soldiers to death. And even some in the Chinese blogosphere talking about Korea being traditionally, historically part of the Chinese homeland. Okinawa being historically part of the Chinese general sphere. What's interesting to me, beyond the speculation whether or not these would be next if Taiwan were to fall, which I think is something to think about, but very much debatable, if you look at the other contingencies that the PLA is planning it for, Korea, India, East China Sea, South China Sea, beyond Taiwan, there's some questions there. These are the areas where China has disputes with its neighbors that may flare up into some sort of conflict, and where China has been building its capabilities and capacities to project power, to intimidate, to deter, and if necessary, to defeat its adversaries, including building aircraft carriers, which I can tell you is a huge undertaking that I think they're only starting to understand what they're getting themselves into when it comes to building an aircraft carrier program. But the last point I'd make in terms of roles and missions of the PLA is domestic. When you think about all the ambitions, even going beyond the periphery, establishing a military facility in Djibouti, talking about other facilities elsewhere, protecting Chinese interests, advancing Chinese interests beyond the Chinese borders, part of their global ambitions, as Peter was referencing. That domestic role is never going to go away. Even after 1989, after Tiananmen, when China created the People's Armed Police with the de facto agreement that the PLA would not be asked again to suppress their own citizens, the PLA ultimately, as I mentioned before, is the military of the Chinese Communist Party. One of its key roles is to preserve the party's grip on political power in China, and it will never get away from that domestic role. No matter how broad the ambitions may be, no matter how capable their aircraft, their air forces, Navy, ballistic missiles, et cetera, may get, that domestic role will always be there. And I think that speaks to both the broadness of China's ambitions, but also that at its heart there's a fragility there, an uncertainty there, that they're never really going to be able to get away from. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Abe. Very important discussion on the PRC's military. I think it's especially important to remember that the point that Abe made, that the PLA belongs to the Chinese Communist Party, not to the nation of the People's Republic of China. It's interesting, actually, that Taiwan's military, until 1994, belonged to the Nationalist Party. And it was only Li Denghui who transferred ownership, as it were, over to the state. So I think we've had some really terrific presentations here, and we have, I believe, about 15 minutes to entertain some questions. So I see we have a couple of hands. Perhaps this gentleman here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm from Nepal. I'm very bored of China. I have a lot of questions. I love China because I want to study China as a graduate student. I have a couple questions I'd like to hear.
Let's just get one question.
Oh, okay, sorry. So Joseph and I from Harvard Kennedy School argue that it's not only the hard powers that matters, the soft power also makes incredible in terms of international affair. But we've seen through a couple of years that China has this grip on the soft power. Rosh Doshi argues that as a peripheral diplomacy. My questions to the team: when we finally defeated Soviet Union, right? We based on a study published by Pew Research arguing that America has lost trust in the institutions of democracy. We are deeply divided, this country, right? And as we know, that China is growing economically but militarily. How is it America going to tackle China while dealing with some of the most depressing issues in domestic affairs? I'd like to hear some of your plans.
Thank you. Nice to get the hard questions up front here. First of all, I think I would take issue with the concept that the PRC actually is doing very well with their soft power. I think actually that's a major failing. But I don't know. Perhaps Allison, could you perhaps comment on that? And maybe Abe,
Sure.
you want to add to that?
No, thank you for that question. I am an optimist at heart, and yes, America's been through a lot over the past few years. The world has been through a lot, but I'm still very optimistic on America. I mean, what else would you expect to hear? But I think that we were born out of adversity. We were born out of innovation and ingenuity, and those are attributes and part of our foundation that remain. And so I'm not giving up on the U.S. and on our soft power. I think there's still, the foundations are still very solid, and we'll continue to produce good things here at home. We're gonna, somebody said it earlier today, hard times are gonna be with us for a little while, but I think we do better in hard times than we do when we've got it easy. So that's not really a very technical answer to your question. It's more of just a red-blooded American flag, waving, public servant for 20 years, and hope that's not the end of it. I love this country, and I think there's a lot we can still do. I agree with Brent. The Chinese soft power. Again, I don't want to delve too deeply into OBOR, into the One Belt, One Road. There's a lot of problems with that. There's a lot of debate we could have over it. Again, like I said, I think COVID was a difficult time for Chinese soft power. And other areas that we didn't touch on in the talk, but that Peter brought up about, sort of what China's doing in the UN system, what China's trying to do in the UN system, to be heavy-handed and coerced. I mean, it's just, I don't think soft power is as strong on the Chinese front as
who's able to create a broad coalition to support Ukraine and who has zero allies. I think it shows that the U.S. has a substantially, exponentially stronger power of attraction than China. The second point, and this is my Tom Friedman anecdotal story to explain the point. Several years ago, I was in Shanghai, and China had just put out their state-produced big movie about some battle in the Qing dynasty that had all the big Chinese stars and all those. It was a big production. And I was in a taxi, and there was a line out the door around the block to the movie theater. And I was surprised because I heard the movie wasn't very good. And I asked the taxi driver, this movie must be really popular if there's a line that big. And he looks and he just grunts and says, Titanic 3D. And that to me says all I needed to know about soft power.
Okay, thank you. Well said. This gentleman in the front here.
Yeah, I think a lot of military and political analysts of foreign affairs focus on the gulf between countries. And oftentimes it seems to me to be better suited to focus on bridges. So for the last 20 years, I've been working on an astrophysics project that includes China. The chair of the Beijing physics department is the University of Utah PhD. So we've met in Russia, we've met in China. Science and mathematics in its pure form is not political. So what other bridges, or why don't we use the sciences and mathematics more often to bridge those gaps rather than having them grow apart?
Excellent question. I would point out that the first agreement that was signed after normalization in 1979 between the United States and Taiwan was the Science and Technology Agreement.
I was counsel on the Foreign Relations Committee that helped
Oh,
facilitate.
okay. Well, you know all about that then. Perhaps I can ask Peter to field this question. He's very clued up on the technology issues.
I've spent a lot of time trying to think about what those bridges are, because I have fond memories of my time in China. I have a number of people that I would certainly consider friends, and that, were we in the same city, I would always try to find a way to speak with them. But I think this is one of the points that was sort of pressed home this morning, that the decision to burn some of these bridges and to build separation was made in Beijing. And one of the areas where I've spent a lot of time and energy researching is in the operations of the United Front Work Department. This is really a policy system. And for those of you who know the Soviet Communist Party well, this was sometimes called National Front in the satellite states. And it's this idea that the party is going to control social interactions. And as a result, a lot of programs that would be, and in the case of dealing with other countries, are in fact great bridge building exercises, whether you call them sister cities, academic partnerships. These are things where the party has taken that lead and has actually made it more difficult for us to engage with Chinese people. And we've kind of let that happen. Just to think of the way that we run the Fulbright program in China relative to other countries. PRC government has picked every Chinese Fulbright recipient to come to the United States. It has not been an open process. It's not been the kind of ideal that you were suggesting. And the PRC has made this also more difficult in recent years on science and technology cooperation, because they've moved away, in some sense, from open science to call it more strategic science and applied science. And I think if I were to sort of put a headline on what the PRC has done, is they're forcing us in our regular interactions to become more complicit with their abuses and with their policies. So that could be in the form of Uyghur forced labor, right? Not just products manufactured in Xinjiang, but exporting those laborers to the eastern seaboard. And now you have trouble trying to find whether or not you're violating US law, or could end up in a trickier situation after June 21st. On S&T in particular, this would be about military-civil fusion, right? There's always a blurring line in a lot of different countries about civilian and military technologies, right? Military and defense draws on national resources. So there's always going to be some connection. But what the PRC has done with the military-civil fusion strategy is ensure that a lot of these potentially dual-use technologies are much more tightly integrated into the defense industrial complex. And therefore, how do you judge which universities you're dealing with? It's, in some cases, it's not even just a question of the universities. You can identify the ones that have big programs, national labs, security clearances to work on big projects. but also, individual departments in other places. And these relationships can often be used as training grounds to ensure that, let's say the nuclear engineers that are designing the next submarine, nuclear power plant to go on a submarine have all been trained from the best nuclear engineering programs in the United States. And how do we deal with those things? So I appreciate the question. I wish I had clear answers, but I think what we have to acknowledge is that the PRC has made choices, and it's chosen to control our interactions with the Chinese people in these ways. And if we don't start from that kind of baseline understanding, we're not going to be able to get to something that is productive and helpful and builds a real bridge.
That's good. Thank you, Peter. I think we're about out of time here. Someone have one quick question? This woman here.
I just have a question for Abe Denmark. We talked about the PLA being like kind of their grand strategy is like building military power greater. But given that the PLA is part of Xi Jinping's party, how much of that strategy is promoting the Chinese expansion versus the party's expansion? Or do you think he views them as the same?
I think I understand what you're asking. What we haven't seen yet in China's engagements with other countries. You heard this morning about how Xi Jinping's thought has been elevated to on par with Chairman Mao. What we haven't seen, though, is in China's relations with other countries trying to export Xi Jinping thought, trying to bring in other fellow travelers into their own particular political system, other than saying, generally speaking, it's easier for them to work with authoritarian systems than democracies, especially authoritarian systems that are corrupt. In terms of the role of the PLA, beyond what they would define as China's borders, I have not seen any indications of efforts to spread the power of the Chinese Communist Party. But that was a big caveat beyond how they define China's borders, right? Because they would include Taiwan into China's borders. So the description of how Beijing has typically described the end state that they would like to see with Taiwan was called one country, two systems, where basically they told Taiwan, you can keep your political system, your economic system, heck, you can even keep your own military. Just say that you're part of the PRC and everything will be fine. After Hong Kong happened, I think everyone saw that there wasn't that much truth to that. But even beyond that, considering that the idea that the CCP would allow for a political system that it does not control fundamentally, as Peter was just describing, is basically incompatible with how the CCP operates. So that was also another reason why one country, two systems was never viable as a implementable policy. And so for the PLA, unification with Taiwan especially is as much about ensuring that the Chinese Communist Party has control over the politics of Taiwan as is about any other aspect of their ambitions as it relates to Taiwan.
Thank you, Abe. We're actually already over time, so we're going to have to wrap up here. But I really appreciate the brilliant insights from our panelists and the great questions. Sorry we couldn't entertain more of them, but just wanted to note that we live in interesting times. As Secretary Blinken said in his speech, our relationship with China is one of the most complex and consequential relationships we have in the world today, and we have no choice but to deal with each other for the foreseeable future. So we'll have to figure out how to do that. I hope our discussions in this conference help us be allow us to be a little more clear-eyed on how we approach that challenge. So as we wrap up our discussion today, please join me in thanking our panelists with a round of applause.